it's time to sit back and relax with your favorite drink. And listen.
The Silent Watchers by Darius McCorkindale. Greg's alarm clock buzzed at precisely 7 a.m., a monotonous hum that marked the beginning of another uneventful day in the suburbs. He groaned, stretched, and reluctantly swung his legs out of bed, his feet sinking into the plush carpet of his bedroom. For a quick shower and a cup of coffee, Greg made his way to the front window, as was his morning routine. The view was the same as always, a picturesque scene of well-manicured lawns, white picket fences, and neatly trimmed hedges. The neighborhood of Maplewood had always been a beacon of suburban tranquility, where the most exciting event was the annual 4th of July barbecue. It was a place where everyone knew each other's names, and nothing out of the ordinary ever happened. But today was different. As Greg sipped his coffee, he noticed a group of 7 or 8 people standing outside his neighbor Serge's house. The sight was unusual enough to catch his attention. Like statues, their faces blank and expressionless. Greg frowned, trying to recall if Serge had mentioned expecting visitors. Well, curiosity got the better of him, and Greg grabbed his phone and dialed Serge's number. It rang several times before Serge answered, his voice groggy and confused. Hello? Hey Serge, it's Greg. You know there's a group of people outside your house? What? No, I didn't notice. What do they want? Well, I'm not sure. They're just standing there. It's kind of creepy. Serge sighed. All right, I'll go check it out. Hey, thanks for letting me know. I told you those conspiracy theories would get you in trouble one day, Serge. Serge let out a soft chuckle. Like I always told you, Greg, it's not a conspiracy if it's true. Well, looks like they're drinking too much of the local water, eh? Greg hung up and continued to watch from his window as Serge emerged from his house, dressed in a bathrobe, and approached the group. He called out to them, waving his arms to get their attention, but there was no response. After a few moments, Serge turned back toward his house, scratching his head in bewilderment. Greg shrugged and decided it was probably some weird prank or a case of mistaken identity. He went about his morning routine, making breakfast and preparing for work. But as he moved through his house, he couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had settled in his stomach. Half an hour later, Greg returned to the front window to check on the situation. His breath caught in his throat. The group had moved. Now they were standing in front of his house, and Serge was among them, his face just as expressionless as the others. They stood in a perfectly straight line, staring directly at Greg's window. A chill ran down Greg's spine. He felt a sudden, inexplicable dread. The people didn't move or speak. They simply watched him with vacant eyes. It was as if they were waiting for something, or someone, and Greg had the sinking feeling that it had everything to do with him. Greg's heart pounded as he stared at the silent, expressionless group outside his window. The unease that had been simmering in his gut now churned violently. He set his coffee mug down with a trembling hand, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. Serge, Greg called out, opening his front door just a crack. Hey, Serge, what's going on? No response. The group didn't even blink. They stood like statues, their empty gazes fixed on him. Greg's mind raced. What could cause such bizarre behavior? Well, he knew he had to do something. He couldn't just stand there and let this eerie spectacle continue. He pulled his phone from his pocket and dialed Serge again. The call went straight to voicemail. Frowning, Greg tried a few more neighbors, but no one picked up. It was as if he was the only person left in the neighborhood who wasn't part of this unsettling tableau. With mounting dread, Greg decided to call the police. His fingers fumbled over the keypad as he dialed 911. The operator's calm, professional voice was a small comfort. 911, what's your emergency? Yeah, this is Greg Parrow from Maplewood. There's a group of people standing outside my house, including my neighbor, Serge. Well, they're not moving or responding, just staring. It's really weird and creepy. The operator paused before responding. Are they threatening you in any way, sir? No, they're just standing there. But something's really wrong. They look vacant, like they're in some kind of trance. All right, sir. I'll dispatch an officer to your location. Please stay inside your house and do not approach the individuals. Greg hung up and took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. He backed away from the door, his eyes never leaving the group outside. He could feel their gaze boring into him, even through the walls of his house. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Greg paced the living room, glancing at the clock every few seconds. The silence outside was oppressive, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. His mind raced with possibilities, each one more disturbing than the last. Finally, he heard the distant wail of sirens. Relief washed over him as a police car pulled up to the curb. 2 officers stepped out, cautiously approaching the group. Greg watched through a gap in the curtains, his heart still pounding in his chest. The officers tried to engage the group, speaking in calm, authoritative tones. When that elicited no response, one of the officers gently shook Serge's shoulder. Well, the moment he made contact, Serge's head snapped around to face the officer, his eyes wide and unseeing. The other members of the group followed suit, their heads turning in perfect unison. The officers exchanged uneasy glances. One of them spoke into his radio, calling for backup. Greg's stomach churned with fear. Whatever was happening to these people, it was beyond the scope of a routine police call. Just then, Serge's voice, cold and mechanical, broke the silence. "We are here for Greg Parrow." The officers looked stunned. One of them turned towards Greg's house, his hand resting on the holster at his hip. Greg stepped back from the window, his mind reeling. What did they want from him? Before he could process what was happening, the group outside began to move in perfect synchronization, stepping closer to his house. The police officers shouted commands, but the group ignored them, their focus steady. Panic surged through Greg as he realized the severity of his situation. He raced to the back of the house, his mind screaming at him to find a way out. He had no idea what these people wanted or why they were fixated on him, but he knew one thing for certain. He had to escape, and fast. Greg's mind raced as he bolted the back door and ran to the garage, hoping to find some means of escape or protection. The garage was cluttered with boxes, gardening tools, and his old mountain bike. He grabbed a crowbar, feeling a semblance of security with the cold metal in his hand. Outside, he heard the police officers shouting, their voices growing more urgent. Greg peeked through the small garage window and saw the group advancing on the house, the officers trying to form a barrier between them and the door. But the watchers moved with a single-minded purpose, their eyes never leaving the front of the house. Greg's phone buzzed. He snatched it from his pocket and saw a new message from an unknown number. "They are under control. Do not trust anyone. Get out now." And his blood ran cold. He had no time to ponder the cryptic warning. He slipped out the back door, staying low, and sprinted through the narrow alley behind his house. He needed answers, and the only place he could think to find them was in Serge's house. He remembered the strange documents he'd found there. Well, he hadn't meant to pry, but had chanced upon them one day. Thinking back on it now, he sensed this might have something to do with his current predicament. As he approached Serge's back door, he saw it was ajar. The house was eerily quiet, the air heavy with an oppressive silence. Greg stepped inside, gripping the crowbar tightly, and made his way to the study where he'd seen the documents before. Oh, the room was a mess, papers strewn everywhere. He frantically searched through them, looking for anything that could explain what was happening. His eyes fell on a folder marked Project Tranquility, Confidential. Inside were reports detailing experiments on mind control drugs, developed under the guise of a government-funded project to enhance community well-being. The drugs were designed to be dispersed through the water supply and common household items, making them virtually undetectable. Greg's stomach churned as he realized the scope of the conspiracy. His neighborhood had been a testing ground. The watchers outside weren't just random people. They were his neighbors, his friends, all unwitting victims of the experiment. And now they'd been turned into mindless drones, programmed to follow orders without question. A noise behind him made Greg whirl around, crowbar raised. It was Serge's wife, Julie. She stood in the doorway, her eyes wide with fear, but still lucid. "Oh, Greg, thank God you're here," she whispered. "We have to stop this." "Julie, what's going on? How do we fix this?" Greg asked, his voice trembling. "Serge found out about the project and he tried to warn everyone, but they got to him first," Julie explained, her voice shaking. "They used him to control the others. We need to find the central transmitter. It's broadcasting the signal that keeps them under control." "What? Where is it?" Greg demanded. "I think it's in the old water treatment plant at the edge of town. That's where they've been coordinating everything." Greg nodded, a plan forming in his mind. "Oh, we need to get there and shut it down. It's the only way to break the control." Julie agreed, and they quickly gathered supplies: flashlights, a map, a couple of kitchen knives. They snuck out of Serge's house and made their way through the neighborhood, avoiding the watchers who continued to stand guard outside Greg's house. As they approached the treatment plant, the air grew colder, and a sense of dread settled over them. The plant was a hulking, dilapidated building surrounded by a chain-link fence. Greg and Julie climbed the fence, cutting themselves on the rusty wire, but adrenaline pushed them forward. Inside, the plant was a labyrinth of dark corridors and strange, echoing noises. They followed the sound of a faint hum, which grew louder as they ventured deeper into the facility. Finally, they reached a large room filled with old machinery and a control panel at the far end. "There it is," Julie whispered, pointing to a transmitter unit on the wall. "That's what's controlling them." Greg approached the unit, his heart pounding. He had no idea how to disable it without causing more harm, but he knew he had to try. He started pulling wires, hoping to short-circuit the device. Suddenly, alarms blared and the hum of the machinery grew louder. "Come on, we have to hurry," Julie urged, keeping watch at the door. Greg's hands worked frantically, his mind racing. Finally, with a desperate yank, he pulled the main power cable free. The transmitter sparked and went dark. The alarm ceased and an eerie silence fell over the plant. "Did it work?" Julie asked, her voice trembling. But Greg didn't have time to answer. Footsteps echoed down the corridor, getting closer. "We need to get out of here," he said, grabbing Julie's hand. They ran back through the plant, a sense of urgency driving them forward. As they emerged into the cold night air, they saw figures approaching from the shadows. The Watchers. But now something was different. Their eyes were no longer blank. They looked confused and disoriented. The control had been broken. "Greg," one of the former Watchers called out, their voice still shaky. It was Serge. Greg felt a surge of relief. "Oh, Serge, are you okay?" Serge nodded, looking around in bewilderment. "I think so. What happened?" "We'll explain everything later," Greg said, his voice filled with hope. "For now, we need to get everyone to safety and expose what's been done here." They made their way back to the neighborhood, ready to face whatever came next. For the first time, Greg felt like they had a fighting chance. As Greg and Julie led Serge and the disoriented neighbors back to the safety of Greg's house, the weight of their discovery hung heavily over them. They knew they'd taken a critical step by disabling the transmitter, but their problems were far from over. The neighborhood, once a beacon of normality, now felt like a battleground. Inside Greg's living room, the former watchers gathered, their expressions slowly shifting from confusion to fear and anger as they began to understand the implications of what had happened to them. Greg and Julie explained the mind control experiment, showing them the documents Serge had collected. The room was filled with a mix of disbelief and outrage. "Look, we have to expose this," Serge said, his voice still shaky but determined. "People need to know what's been done to us." "But how?" Julie asked. "If we just go to the police, they'll dismiss us. Or worse, they might be in on it." Greg paced the room, deep in thought. "We need some solid evidence and a way to get it out to the public quickly. The documents we have are a start, but we need more. Something irrefutable." As they debated their next steps, Greg's phone buzzed again. It was another message from the unknown number. "They know. Reinforcements are coming. You have 1 hour." Greg's blood ran cold. "We don't have much time. Whoever's behind this is sending more people to silence us." Panic spread through the group, but Greg raised his hands to calm them. "We need to act fast. Serge, do you know if there's any place where they might be keeping more evidence?" Serge thought for a moment. "There's an old office building on the outskirts of town. It used to be a research facility. But that's where they're operating from now." "Then that's where we have to go," Greg decided. "But we can't all go. Some of us need to stay here and secure the house. Julie, can you and a few others stay back and fortify this place? If we don't return in 2 hours, you need to go out and find help." Julie nodded. "Yeah, we'll be ready." Greg, Serge, and a few other volunteers armed themselves with what they could: crowbars, kitchen knives, anything that might offer protection. They piled into Serge's van and headed towards the old office building, the atmosphere tense with fear and anticipation. As they approached the facility, they could see it was heavily guarded. Security personnel, likely under the influence of the same mind control drug, were patrolling the perimeter. Greg and the others parked a distance away and formulated a plan. "We'll split into 2 groups," Greg said. "One will create a diversion while the other sneaks in and gathers evidence." Greg, Serge, and one other neighbor, Joanne, volunteered for the infiltration team, while the rest prepared to distract the guards. The diversion team set off fireworks and started small fires on the opposite side of the building, drawing the guards away from their posts. With the path temporarily clear, Greg and his team slipped into the building through a back entrance. The interior was a maze of corridors and offices filled with high-tech equipment and stacks of documents. They moved quickly, gathering as much evidence as they could find: files, computer hard drives, anything that might prove the existence of Project Tranquility. In the central office, Greg found a locker drawer labeled Project Logs. He pried it open with his crowbar and pulled out a thick file. As he skimmed through the pages, his eyes widened. Detailed logs of experiments, names of the affected individuals, and correspondence with higher-ups in the government. This was exactly what they needed. "Right, let's get out of here," Serge urged, his eyes darting nervously around the room. "We've got enough." As they turned to leave, alarms blared throughout the building. The guards were returning, alerted by the diversion. Greg's heart pounded as they raced back through the labyrinthine corridors, clutching their precious evidence. They burst out of the back entrance and sprinted towards the van, dodging the searchlights and the shouts of the guards. As they neared the vehicle, a guard lunged at Serge, tackling him to the ground. Greg swung the crowbar, knocking the guard out, and pulled Serge to his feet. They piled into the van and sped away, the facility shrinking in the rearview mirror. Greg clutched the file to his chest, knowing they had what they needed to expose the conspiracy. But as they drove back to the neighborhood, headlights appeared in the distance, growing closer. "No, they're coming after us," Joanne said, her voice trembling. Greg's mind raced. He had to get the evidence to safety, but how? He pulled out his phone and handed it to Serge, who called Julie. "Julie, we have what we need, but they're right behind us. We're leading them away from the neighborhood. Be ready to move the others if we don't make it back." Julie's voice was firm. "Got it. Be careful, Serge." He handed the phone back to Greg, who hung up and looked at Serge and Joanne. "Hey, we have to split up. Serge, take the evidence and go to the local news station. They need to see this. Joanne and I will lead them away." Serge hesitated, but nodded. They pulled over briefly, handing the files and hard drives to Serge. "Hey, good luck," Greg said, gripping Serge's shoulder. Serge took off into the night, while Greg and Joanne continued driving, the headlights of their pursuers getting closer. The chase was on, and Greg knew they were running out of time. Part 2. Greg's knuckles turned white as he gripped the steering wheel, the van hurtling down the dark, deserted road. Joanne kept glancing nervously over her shoulder at the headlights growing larger in the rearview mirror. The black SUVs chasing them were relentless, their engines roaring with a menacing intensity. "We need to lose them," Joanne said, her voice tight with fear. "I know," Greg replied, his mind racing. The road ahead split into a T-junction, and without hesitation, Greg swerved sharply to the left, tires screeching as the van struggled to maintain traction on the gravel. The SUVs followed, the gap between them closing. Greg spotted an old, overgrown logging road up ahead. "Right, hold on," he shouted as he veered off the main road, the van jolting violently as it plunged into the dense forest. Branches scraped against the sides of the van, and the headlights flickered as they bounced over the rough terrain. The logging road twisted and turned, a labyrinth of narrow paths and hidden obstacles. Greg maneuvered the van with skill, but the SUVs were built for off-road pursuits and were gaining ground. The beams of their headlights sliced through the trees, casting eerie shadows that danced in the night. "There," Joanne pointed to a narrow trail barely visible through the underbrush. "Take that path." Greg turned sharply, the van narrowly missing a large tree trunk as it barreled down the narrow trail. The SUVs hesitated, momentarily losing sight of the van. Greg and Joanne held their breath, praying the dense forest would provide enough cover to escape. For a moment, it seemed like they'd succeeded. The trail opened into a small clearing, and Greg slowed the van, catching his breath. But the reprieve was short-lived. The distant sound of engines grew louder, and soon the SUVs emerged from the forest, their headlights sweeping the clearing. "We're trapped," Joanne whispered, her eyes wide with fear. Greg's mind raced. They had the evidence, but they needed to buy Serge time to reach the news station. "Well, we have to make a stand," he said, determination hardening his voice. "We can't let them get to Serge." He pulled the van to a stop and jumped out, Joanne following close behind. They took cover behind a large boulder, clutching the crowbars and kitchen knives they'd brought with them. The SUVs screeched to a halt, and men in dark suits and tactical gear poured out, their faces shadowed and menacing. "Come out with your hands up," one of the men shouted, his voice amplified by a bullhorn. "We know you have the documents. Hand them over and no one gets hurt." Greg exchanged a glance with Joanne. "Stay low and be ready to run," he whispered. The men advanced, their flashlights slicing through the darkness. Greg's heart pounded as he calculated their approach. He knew they had to create a distraction, something to give Serge enough time to get away and expose the truth. As the men drew closer, Greg grabbed a large rock and hurled it into the trees on the opposite side of the clearing. It crashed through the underbrush, and the men turned, their flashlights following the noise. Taking advantage of the distraction, Greg and Joanne darted towards another trail on the far side of the clearing. "Right, split up," Greg whispered to Joanne. "We'll have a better chance of leading them away." Joanne nodded, fear and resolve mingling in her eyes. She took off down one path while Greg sprinted down another, the sound of pursuit growing fainter as they put distance between themselves and the clearing. Greg's lungs burned as he ran, his mind focused on one goal: buying time. He could hear the shouts and footsteps behind him, but he didn't dare look back. The forest was a maze, but Greg had grown up exploring these woods and knew pretty much every twist and turn. He reached a narrow ravine and scrambled down, the loose rocks slipping under his feet. He hid behind a large boulder, his breaths coming in ragged gasps. The men's flashlights danced above the ravine, searching for any sign of movement. Greg's heart pounded in his ears as he stayed perfectly still, praying they wouldn't find him. Minutes passed, which felt like hours. Finally, the men moved on, their voices fading into the distance. Greg let out a shaky breath, knowing he had to keep moving. He climbed out of the ravine and headed back towards the main road, hoping to find Joanne. As he emerged from the forest, he saw her hiding behind a cluster of trees, her eyes scanning the road. "Yeah, Joanne," he called softly, and she rushed over to him. "Did we lose them?" she asked, her voice trembling. "For now," Greg replied. "But we need to get back to the neighborhood and make sure everyone's safe. Sarah should be at the news station by now." They made their way back through the forest, exhaustion setting in, but their determination unyielding. As they approached the neighborhood, they saw the familiar sight of their homes, a beacon of normality amidst the chaos. Julie and the others were waiting, their faces a mix of relief and worry. "Did you get the evidence?" Julie asked. "Serge has it," Greg said, a weary smile on his face. "He's on his way to the news station. It's up to him now." The group huddled together, the tension slowly easing. They'd faced a terrifying ordeal, but they'd taken a crucial step towards exposing the truth. As they looked out at the darkened streets of their neighborhoods, they knew the battle was far from over, but they were ready to face whatever came next. Greg and Joanne shared a nod of silent understanding. The evidence was out of their hands, but they'd done their part. Now they had to trust that Serge would succeed in bringing the truth to light and ending the nightmare that had consumed their lives. Greg, Joanne, Julie, and the others waited anxiously in Greg's living room, every noise outside making them jump. The adrenaline from the chase was wearing off, replaced by a heavy fatigue. Greg kept glancing at his phone, hoping for some sign that Serge had made it safely to the news station. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Greg's phone buzzed with a call. It was Serge. "Oh, Serge, did you make it?" Greg asked, his voice taut with anticipation. "Yeah, I'm here," Serge replied, his voice steady but urgent. "I've given them the documents and the hard drives. Oh, the news director is shocked. They're going to go live with the story tonight." A collective sigh of relief swept through the room. Well, they'd done it. They'd exposed the conspiracy. "That's great news, Serge," Greg said, a smile breaking through his exhaustion. "Now stay safe. They'll be looking for you." "You too, Greg," Serge replied. "I think we started a war. Be ready for the fallout." Greg hung up and turned to the group. "Well, the story's going live tonight. We did it." Cheers and hugs erupted among the neighbors. For the first time in days, there was a sense of hope. They'd struck a blow against the forces that had tried to control them. As the news broadcast time approached, they gathered around the television, the room silent with anticipation. The local news anchor appeared, his expression serious. Good evening. We have breaking news on a developing story that involves a mind control experiment right here in our town. Our investigative team has uncovered shocking documents detailing a project known as Project Tranquility, which was allegedly funded and conducted by a government agency. The project involved dispersing mind control drugs through the local water supply and other means, affecting many residents of our community. We have obtained exclusive evidence and interviews with those affected. Footage of Serge handing over the documents played on the screen, followed by interviews with several of their neighbors, detailing their experiences and the mind control that they'd been subjected to. The broadcast was powerful and damning, laying bare the sinister experiment that had turned their lives upside down. The phone lines at the station lit up with calls from concerned citizens and reporters from national networks. The story was going viral, spreading like wildfire. Greg and the others watched, a mix of relief and vindication washing over them. They'd succeeded in getting the truth out. But their relief was short-lived. As the broadcast continued, there was a loud crash outside. Greg rushed to the window and saw several black SUVs pulling up, armed men spilling out and surrounding the house. Well, the realization hit him like a punch to the gut. The people behind Project Tranquility weren't going to go down without a fight. "They're here," Greg shouted, adrenaline surging back through his veins. "Well, we need to defend the house." Julie and the others sprang into action, barricading doors and windows with furniture and anything they could find. Greg grabbed the crowbar again, ready to defend his home and the people inside. The armed men began pounding on the door, shouting commands for them to surrender. Greg stood firm, his heart pounding. "We won't let them take us," he said, stilling himself for the confrontation. Suddenly, a loudspeaker crackled to life outside. "This is the FBI. Stand down and put your weapons on the ground." Greg's heart skipped a beat. He exchanged a bewildered glance with Joanne. Had their story reached the right people in time? Through the window, Greg saw men in tactical gear, emblazoned with the FBI logo, moving in and disarming the armed men from the SUVs. The scene was chaotic, but it was clear that the tide had turned in their favor. A few moments later, an FBI agent knocked on the door. "We're here to help," he called out. "It's safe now." Greg and the others cautiously opened the door, relief flooding through them as the agents entered. "We've been tracking this operation for a while," the agent explained. "Your broadcast gave us the evidence we needed to act." Tears of relief and exhaustion streamed down Julie's face. "Thank you," she said, her voice breaking. "We didn't know how much longer we could hold out." The FBI agents secured the house and escorted the residents to safety, providing medical attention and taking statements. Greg felt the tension draining from his body, replaced by a profound sense of gratitude and disbelief. They'd survived, and the truth was out. In the following days, the news of Project Tranquility spread nationwide. Investigations were launched, and those responsible were arrested. The neighborhood began the slow process of healing, the shared trauma forging a stronger bond among the residents. Greg and Joanne stood on Greg's porch, looking out at the quiet, sunlit street. The nightmare was over, but the scars remained. "We did it," Joanne said softly, her eyes reflecting both relief and sorrow. Greg nodded, putting an arm around her. "Yeah, we did. Now we can start to rebuild." As they watched the neighborhood slowly returning to normal, they knew that while the fight had been won, the memory of the silent watchers would stay with them forever, a stark reminder of the price of vigilance and the power of truth. The neighborhood had slowly returned to its peaceful routine, the events of Project Tranquility becoming a dark chapter that everyone was eager to close. Greg and the others had fought to expose the conspiracy and were hailed as heroes, and life seemed to be getting back to normal. The local news station continued to cover the aftermath, ensuring that the story stayed in the public eye. One sunny afternoon, Greg was sitting on his porch, enjoying a rare moment of tranquility. He sipped his coffee, watching children play in the street and neighbors chatting, revealed that the shadow of the mind control experiment had finally lifted. Just then, Greg's phone buzzed with a message. He glanced at it, expecting another news update or a message from Serge. Instead, it was a text from an unknown number. "You think it's over?" Greg's heart skipped a beat. He stared at the message, a cold dread creeping over him. He looked around, suddenly feeling exposed. His mind raced. Was this some kind of sick joke? Or was there something they'd missed? Before he could process the message further, Julie walked up to the porch, waving at him. "Hey Greg, how are you holding up?" Greg forced a smile, slipping the phone into his pocket. "I'm good, Julia. Just trying to relax." Julie sat down next to him, her expression thoughtful. "It's been a wild ride, hasn't it? God, I'm glad things are finally getting back to normal." "Yeah, me too," Greg replied, but his mind was still on the mysterious message. He decided not to mention it to Julie yet. No need to worry her if it turned out to be nothing. As they chatted, Greg noticed Serge walking down the street towards them, a serious look on his face. He was carrying a small box under his arm. Greg's unease grew. "Hey, what's in the box, Serge?" he called out as Serge approached. Serge climbed the porch steps, his expression grim. "Hey, we need to talk," he said, setting the box down on the table between them. He opened it, revealing a series of documents and a small device that looked like a scanner. "What's this?" Julie asked, leaning in to examine the contents. Serge took a deep breath. "After everything that happened, I couldn't shake the feeling that we might have missed something. So I did some digging on my own. These documents, they're from a source inside the project. They suggest that the mind control drug wasn't just in the water supply. It's also designed to be administered through electronic devices." Greg's blood ran cold. "Electronic devices? You mean phones, TVs, anything connected to the internet?" Serge confirmed. "The drug was encoded in a way that it could be triggered remotely. We might have stopped the initial experiment, but the infrastructure's still there." Julie looked horrified. "Are you saying they could still control us?" Serge nodded. "Potentially, yes. That's why I bought this scanner. It can detect the presence of the drug in electronic devices. We need to check our phones, our computers, everything." Greg pulled out his phone, the earlier text message flashing in his mind. He handed it to Serge, who ran the scanner over it. The device beeped, a red light flashing ominously. "It's in here," Serge said quietly. "They've got access to all our devices." Panic set in among the group. Julie quickly grabbed her phone and other electronic gadgets, bringing them to Serge to be scanned. Each one beeped with the same red light, confirming their worst fears. "We need to warn everyone," Greg said, his voice urgent. "We need to get rid of these devices and go off the grid." Serge nodded. "I'll contact the FBI and let them know what we found. But we have to act fast. If they can trigger the drug remotely, we don't know when they might do it." As they worked to gather and dismantle their electronics, the full weight of the situation settled over them. They'd won a crucial battle, but the war was far from over. The shadow of Project Tranquility still loomed, a sinister presence lurking in the very devices that they'd come to rely on. That night, as Greg lay in bed, the implications of Serge's discovery gnawed at him. The message on his phone echoed in his mind. "You think it's over?" He realized with a chilling certainty that the fight against those who'd sought to control them was just beginning. Those who'd created the Silent Watchers might have been exposed, but their reach was far greater than anyone had imagined. Now Greg and his friends were more determined than ever to uncover the full extent of the conspiracy and put an end to it once and for all. Well, just like Serge said, it's not a conspiracy if it's true. I don't know. Nonsense. Good bit of fun. Just thought I wanted to have fun with that story. Didn't have to make too much sense. I know you're like, oh yeah, but you have this detail and that doesn't... Oh yeah, Ouija boards weren't invented until the 1880s. How can an ancient cult do it? It's just a bit of fun, guys, okay? It's just a story, all right? So please just enjoy it for what it is, all right? Anyway, that's enough for me for this evening. Yeah, thanks for the positive feedback on my mental health. All the nice comments you left. I'm doing all right. I'm hanging in there. It's just gets a bit low sometimes, and this has been a really nice channel for sort of focusing on doing something positive. So yes, please enjoy the stories. They are just stories, and they're just meant to be fun. Okay. Right. Till next time, my dear friends. Very, very sweet dreams, and bye bye.
Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to this story today. Really means a lot to me and to the author of the story, of course. Well, if you want to know more about me, I'm pretty much everywhere on social media. You can find me on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. You can download my music on SoundCloud. I've got a Patreon if you feel like. Throw me $1 or $2. Very much appreciated. And of course, on Reddit, I have a place where you can leave stories if you want me to read one that you've written. Well, hoping to see you all again very soon. Till then, sweet dreams. Bye-bye.